Lecture 2. Social Class and Social Mobility. Imagine an island that is divided into two countries. In the People's Republic of Casteland, 50% of the people are well off and 50% are poor. And in the Popular Republic of Classland, it's exactly the same. Each is as equal or unequal as the other. But there is at least one striking difference. In Casteland, all the children of the well-off are themselves well-off, and all the children of the poor are themselves poor. In Classland, 75% of the children of the well-off remain well-off, but 25% become poor, while for the children of the poor, it's the other way around. 25% become well-off, and 75% remain poor. Now, if you knew nothing else about the two countries, which of the two would you prefer to be a citizen of? Whatever your answer to that question, it's probably not a big stretch to say that these are quite different types of society. It's likely they would have quite different institutional arrangements, and almost certainly quite different legitimatory ideologies to justify their systems of social stratification. Perhaps in Casteland, every child is told that in the beginning God divided the people at the creation of the world into gold and bronze people, and that golden parents always have golden children, and everyone should be happy with their lot. Or maybe it's like in Plato's Republic, where there are golden and bronze people, but occasionally the golden beget bronze, and vice versa, and it's the job of the all-wise guardians to ensure meritocracy by discerning the precise qualities of each child and making sure they are, of course for the good of all, either demoted or promoted to their rightful place. This rather fanciful tale brings a number of issues into relief that we might want to ask about any society. How open is the society? Meaning, to what extent does social position at birth determine or predict adult position? Does the degree of openness of the society predict or explain other features of the society? For example, are more open societies less prone to political violence, more democratic, more socially liberal, more economically efficient? Or is the causality in the other direction? Does democracy or more industrial development tend to produce societies that are more socially open? Descending from the macro to the micro level, does more social mobility make people happier if they move upward, or unhappier if they move downward? Does it affect their physical or mental health? Is a more mobile society a less socially integrated society, with weaker connections between the socially mobile and their non-mobile friends and kin? Is the process of mobility dislocating for the mobile, so that they never feel they fit into their new social destination and always carry the baggage of their origins around with them? Or does everyone just forget about where they come from and get on with whatever they're doing? And if we think that at least some social mobility is desirable, how much social mobility is optimal? Do the chances of reaching the top of the social hierarchy have to be literally the same for everybody? To what lengths are we prepared to go to achieve that? Abolishing private education? Prohibiting bedtime stories for your kids because some kids have parents who don't read to them? Compensating or having affirmative action programs for those that lost out in the genetic lottery and consequently have a little less of whatever it takes to reach the pinnacles of achievement? Perhaps there comes a point when more social mobility means less of other things that we also value, like family life as we know it. And returning to questions of legitimacy, what stories about mobility and opportunity do we tell ourselves to justify or challenge current social arrangements? That everyone is formally equal and therefore has a fair chance? That the playing field isn't even, but there are no social obstacles that can't, with sufficient effort and application, be overcome? That there are some people who are born into social conditions that effectively give them no chance, and there's nothing that can be done about it? And if our answers to all these questions imply a preference for a more mobile rather than less mobile society, how do we deal with the downwardly mobile? Everyone tends to think of social mobility as an unequivocally good thing, but, at least if the stakes are high enough, those who experience social demotion are unlikely to see it in that way. Isn't it more likely that they will resent their lot? Perhaps resent it enough to prove a source of social or political instability. And might the idea of meritocracy even make this worse? Social demotion may be hard to take, but surely it's even harder to take if you're supposed to believe that you deserved it because, well, you weren't smart enough or didn't try hard enough. The losers rarely appreciate the justice of whatever decision mechanism produced what, as they see it, is the wrong result. Whatever your answers to these questions, it's clear that social mobility, in all its possible meanings, and quite a few that make no sense at all, is on the current political agenda. Here are just a small selection of the things a Google search brought up. Social mobility in decline in Britain, official survey finds, opines The Guardian on the 21st of the 1st, 2020. This headline was rather notable because, in fact, if one read the article, it turned out that actually that's not what the official survey said, because the official survey had no information whatsoever actually about social mobility in it. Low social mobility is one of the most important social issues facing the country, says the Centre for Social Mobility at the University of Exeter. Since the 1980s, social mobility in the UK appears to have stalled or deteriorated in terms of social class and income measures respectively. Boston Consulting Group, 2017. I think there's sometimes a pessimistic view of social mobility, which sees it as being in decline, and I'm not convinced that the evidence is that it is declining. I think the economy has changed, and that's made it more complicated. But I'm not sure there was a golden age when it was fantastic, and now it's in a terrible mess. Alan Francis, the recently appointed Deputy Chair of the government's Social Mobility Commission. And finally, Martin Wolf in the FT in 2019, perhaps no topic is more buried in hypocrisy and confusion than social mobility. Before we get on to talking about what social mobility is, I just want to spend a few moments talking about what it isn't. This might seem a bit odd, but in a lot of political and newspaper discourse, social mobility is often confused with economic growth, or rather with the effect of economic growth on everyone's welfare. The black line on this graph, which is the only thing I want you to focus on here, plots the path of the average living standard, real GDP per capita, from the turn of the 20th century until round about today. It's a tale of growth, with quite a few random shocks that have disrupted the general upward momentum. Broadly speaking, we are on average about 6 times as well off today as we were around 1900. Of course, this is just an average, and in addition, the experience of this growth have been rather different for different generations. My grandparents were born around 1909. By the time they left school, per capita GDP was actually lower than when they were born. At age 40, it had grown by 43%, but they had to wait until age 52, most of their adult life, to experience it doubling. My father, born in 1933, experienced it doubling by the age of 30. I was born in 1961 and I experienced it doubling by the age of 32. My cousin's daughter, born in 1978, is still waiting for it to double in her lifetime. My undergraduates, born in the first couple of years of the new millennium, well, we'll have to see. This is the context in which social mobility occurs. Everyone is on an escalator. But social mobility is not about the general upward direction of the escalator. It's about shuffling who stands on which of the steps. So let's then say a little bit more about social mobility. The most abstract definition of it is that it is a movement between two positions in two distributions that people believe have some sort of social significance. Those distributions might concern a characteristic of parents and children, in which case we usually talk about intergenerational mobility, or characteristics of the same individual at different points in their career, in which case we talk about intragenerational mobility. In this lecture, I will mainly focus on the former, intergenerational mobility. So, what kind of distribution defines the origins and destinations of intergenerational mobility? An obvious one might be something like economic welfare, which in practice will be measured in terms of wealth or income or earnings. In other words, we find out where in the income distribution an individual's family was when they were growing up, and then where they themselves are when they are, well, let's say 40 years of age, and compare the two. This is, broadly speaking, the kind of approach favoured by economists. Strictly speaking, we might want to label this economic mobility rather than social mobility, but unless you want to argue that the economic is not in some sense social, it isn't worth quibbling about labels. Among European and especially British sociologists, especially in the last 40 years, the dominant conceptual framework has been to think of movement between different social class positions. To go into what exactly that means, and just as importantly, doesn't mean, would be a lecture in itself. Suffice to say, for the moment, that in practice, the measurement of social class is usually achieved by aggregating occupations into larger groups with some attention being paid to self-employment status, with again the comparison being between the social class of the household in which the individual grows up and their own adult class position. This account is obviously by no means exhaustive. People have also studied mobility in terms of social status groups, and in the United States and countries influenced by the US's intellectual perspective, there is a whole tradition of looking at social mobility in terms of scales of occupational prestige and/or scales of socioeconomic status. Saying something with empirical content about social mobility means grappling with a lot of practical measurement challenges. What we can say for sure about mobility is always said looking backwards. Mobility is a process that evolves over time. You're born into a family in a certain set of circumstances, which themselves may change during the period during which you grow up. You go out into the world, enter the labour market, make a career, and around about, again, let's say age 40 or so, you will have established yourself. To collect data on what exactly happened, we have to either 1. Sample a bunch of adults and ask them about their past, or 2. Sample a bunch of children and wait until they become adults in order to find out what happened to them. Either way, the social mobility that is recorded is in the past, and we're learning about the social processes that happened in the past that influenced the outcomes. From a political point of view, a cynic might say, this is terribly convenient. The consequences, good, bad, or indifferent, of policy interventions that are made now intended to have an impact on social mobility will not be known for quite a few years, and certainly only long after whatever government has introduced them has ceased to be in office. Governments like to talk about social mobility, but actually know rather little about the likely impact of anything they say they are doing to promote it. Another troubling issue is the existence of data. Even if we are happy to peer back into the past, there is in the UK a lack of data about intergenerational wealth, income, or earnings mobility, and the limited amount that exists is of such poor quality that major questions have been raised about how to sensibly interpret it. Happily, the situation is better in other countries, especially the Nordic countries, where scholars are able to make use of population-level register data linked to tax records, and also in the US, where similar sorts of data have been made available to researchers by the tax authorities. But in the UK, we're not so lucky, and in the main, though not exclusively, we're stuck with survey data of various sorts. So let's examine what they have to say about one simple empirical question. Has social mobility in Britain increased or decreased? I'm going to look at this from two perspectives. Firstly, in terms of income mobility, and then in terms of class mobility. So let's start then with income mobility. The basic data for this come from a comparison of two birth cohorts, one born in 1958, the so-called NCDS or National Child Development Study, and the other in 1970, the so-called BCS or British Cohort Study. These follow all the children born within a few days of each other into adulthood. The household income of their parents was recorded when the kids were 16 years of age, and their own earnings were recorded when they were in their early 30s. For all sorts of reasons, these data are far from perfect, and the authors of the study, which I'm going to discuss, are well aware of it. It is, however, more or less all we have, and they have gone to heroic lengths to produce it, and also to try and consider what the likely effects might be of many of the obvious deficiencies in the original data. So what do they find? There are a number of different ways to present their results, but this table does the job in a simple, straightforward way. In it, they classify each cohort member in two ways. Firstly, by which quarter of the earnings distribution they themselves fall into, and secondly, by which quarter of their parents' income distribution they fall into. So that gives us an origin quartile and a destination quartile. They then show us for each quartile of the parents' income distribution what the probability is that in this case a son will fall into each of the quartiles of the earnings distribution. By comparing these probabilities across the two birth cohorts, we can form an impression as to whether mobility has increased or decreased. As an illustration, in the 1958 cohort, the probability of someone who was in the bottom quartile at age 16 still being there in their early 30s is 0.31 or 31%. But in the 1970 cohort, it is 0.39 or 39%. Moving to the other end of the distribution, in the 1958 cohort, someone in the top quartile of the parental distribution had a probability of 0.34 of being found there in their early 30s, but the same probability is 0.42 for the 1970 birth cohort. Close inspection of these tables will lead you to the conclusion that there is a difference in the mobility experience of the two cohorts, and that this difference is in the direction of a decline in mobility. These are the tables that launched 100 editorials and a similar number of pious parliamentary words about the decline in social mobility in the UK and the need to do something about it. I believe this reaction took the original authors somewhat by surprise, for they are more than well aware of all the caveats that need to be made about the underlying data, and that should urge a lot of caution before one rushes to a very definite policy-relevant conclusion. Notice, for example, that I've not shown you the comparable table for women. The conclusions about women are in fact particularly insecure due to the fact that earnings around the age of 30 were absent for many of the women in these cohorts, for the obvious reason that this is slap bang in the middle of the family formation phase for many of these women. Let's move on then to social class mobility. So we know something about income mobility, but we're not sure how much weight to give the evidence we have. What about social class mobility? Here we have much more data, though we're still not without headaches in trying to interpret it. I'm going to give you a brief overview of some work I've recently done myself, which tries to put together all the evidence that we have from cross-sectional sources and compare it with the picture we get from other studies using slightly different methods. By cross-sectional sources, I mean surveys taken at a particular moment in time of people in the age range of roughly 20 to 64, which collect information about their own occupation and the occupation of their father, usually when the respondent was around 14 years of age. Doing this gives me 22 cross-sectional observation points, somewhat unevenly spread between the early 1960s and 2018. The individuals, both men and women, are categorized on the basis of their occupation into the 7 classes of the so-called National Statistics Socioeconomic Classification. For our purposes, we will call these simply social classes, and we're interested in intergenerational movement between them. You will notice some divisions in the classification by dashed lines. These denote hierarchical divisions such that I'll regard crossing these lines as representing either upward or downward mobility. It's important to realize that over the years, the distribution of social origins, as well as social destinations across these social class categories, has changed. To cut a long story short, the proportion of people coming from managerial and professional occupational backgrounds has increased somewhat substantially, and the proportion from working class backgrounds has decreased. The same sort of shift can be seen in the distribution of destination classes. In fact, one would also see this pattern in each of the individual origin by destination tables that make up the underlying data, such as these two, which cross-classify fathers in the rows, with in this case sons in the columns. This has the important consequence of ensuring that we must observe some mobility in these tables, because the distribution of fathers and sons, or daughters, across the social class categories will differ. So what do we see if we focus on crude measures of total, upward and downward mobility? In this slide we see the evolving picture for the men. Total mobility here means the proportion who strictly remain in the same class as their father, while upward and downward mobility are defined as crossing one or more of the dashed line boundaries I showed you a moment ago. What we seem to see for the men is a 7 to 8 percentage point increase in total mobility over 6 decades. A similar increase in upward mobility, which seems to have come to an end round about the turn of the millennium, and not much change in downward mobility again until the turn of the millennium, after which there may have been a slight upturn of a few percentage points. Turning to the women, we again see a slight increase in total mobility. However, it is the pattern of upward and downward mobility that holds the most interest. Since the early 1990s, there seems to have been a slight downturn in downward mobility, but a slightly stronger increase in upward mobility. Interesting as these graphs are, however, they don't actually directly address the question of how dependent social class destinations are on social class origins, and whether this has changed over time to a degree we should care about. Questions about equality of opportunity are questions about the relative chances of success of people from different class backgrounds in attaining some destinations and avoiding others. In as far as these relativities have widened, we might speak of the association between class origin and class destination becoming stronger. In as far as the relativities have closed, we might speak of the association becoming weaker, or, as it is sometimes put, greater social openness or greater social fluidity. But how should we do this? Well, the details are involved, and I'm not going to go into them here, but one approach is to fit a statistical model to the series of 22 mobility tables and estimate a number which expresses the strength of association in each table relative to the strength in a baseline table. In this case, for reasons related to what data are available, the baseline year differs depending on whether we're looking at men or women. For men, it is in the early 1970s, and for women, it is 1989. The baseline association gets a value of 1, and the association in the rest of the tables is to be interpreted relative to that. A number higher than 1 indicates that association is stronger in that year, ergo less social class fluidity. A number less than 1 indicates association has decreased, ergo greater social class fluidity, or if you like, more equal mobility chances. This chart shows how the pattern evolves for men over time. Each point represents an estimate for a particular survey, and the confidence intervals give an impression of the uncertainty surrounding each of the estimates. For some of them, particularly in the early years, there is considerable uncertainty. However, the overall pattern seems to suggest a downward trend until roughly the turn of the millennium, and thereafter some stability. This implies an increase in social fluidity compared to the early 1970s. In other words, a movement towards greater class equality in mobility life chances. But what of the women? Here, the picture is much more uncertain. Certainly for most of the period under observation, there seems to be a lot of trendless fluctuation, with a lot of uncertainty surrounding the estimated points. However, towards the end of the series, there does seem to be a bit of evidence of an increase in social fluidity. The reason for the different patterns of change for males and females are complex and probably partly related actually to differences in what is actually being measured in the two cases. For the men, in the vast majority of cases, it is the occupation they hold at the time of the survey. But for many of the women, because they were not in the labour market when they were surveyed, the occupation they are reporting will have been held at some unknown time in the past. And to make things more complicated, the proportion of women reporting a past occupation will have decreased dramatically over the period as female labour force participation rates increased. All this serves to create a rather blurred impression of the female trend. Now, these two graphs are only one source of evidence about class mobility. What of other sources? It turns out that there are at least two other sources that are broadly comparable in the way they organize their data into social classes, but rather than rely on cross-sections, use instead data on birth cohorts. The first of these is the work of Bukodi and Thorpe. They used the same two 1958 and 1970 birth cohorts as those used in the study we looked at earlier on income mobility, but they're able to supplement it with comparable information from a cohort of children born in 1946. Using exactly the same method as I used a moment ago, they estimate the strength of association between class origin and class destination in the 1958 and 1970 cohorts relative to that found in the 1946 cohort, in all cases for individuals around the age of 38. Here I have superimposed their estimates, represented by the blue blobs, on top of my graph. It's important to note that one can't validly compare the levels of these estimates with my estimates. What one can do, however, is compare the direction of travel. For the men, it superficially looks as though there's a slight tendency for social class fluidity to increase, manifested in the last blue blob situated in the early 2000s. This would be rather convenient because it fits in with the pattern of my cross-sectional estimates. But alas, it turns out that we cannot statistically reject the hypothesis that this point differs from the two earlier ones, and thus we can't claim this as additional supporting evidence for a story about increasing equality. In this graph, I add estimates from a third study. These are the red blobs. Again, this has a birth cohort design, and the data are actually derived from linking together censuses so that fathers are matched with children. This time, class destination is measured between the ages of 30 and 36, and we can compare three different birth cohorts. Again, I need to remind you that comparisons of level with my cross-sectional estimates and Bukodi and Goldthorpe's estimates are not legitimate, and we are only interested in the direction of the trend. The results are in some ways a little bit more comforting. They show a clear increase in social fluidity between the 1990s and the new millennium, and stability thereafter. And, joy of joy, the contrast is soundly statistically significant. Turning to the women, I'm afraid we have to conclude that results are not clear-cut. Goldthorpe and Bukodi find a statistically significant trend towards greater openness. The blue blobs basically descend from left to right. But Busher and Sturgis's red blobs, well, these seem to represent mere trendless fluctuation. So what should we believe? The one thing that's clear is that there is no evidence that social class fluidity has decreased, or to put it another way, the association between where you start in life and where you end up has increased. Depending on where you look, relative mobility chances have either stayed much the same, or there has actually been a trend towards equalization. Now, if we believe that the latter has taken place, that then immediately raises the question, has this equalization been of a magnitude that we should care about? My graphs clearly don't answer this question. It's not obvious to me, and therefore presumably not obvious to you, what a move from an index value of 1 to, say, 0.68 actually means. Is that a lot, or is it a little? Thankfully, we can do better than this by making a counterfactual comparison. Consider the last mobility table in my series of tables. This is for the period 2014 to 18. The information in it tells you the percentage of men who end up in a particular destination class given that they started in a particular origin class. So, for instance, 39% of men who started in class 1 ended up in class 1. but only 14% of men who started in class 7 ended up in class 1. We can now use a trick to construct a what-if scenario. The details of this are not important, but in essence rely on the fact that we can decompose the frequencies in a contingency table in a way that reflects two different influences. The first of these relate merely to the proportions of individuals found in the class origin distribution and the class destination distribution. These are sometimes referred to as the marginal distributions. These proportions contain no information about the association in the table. Association is information about what goes with what, the relative likelihood that if you start somewhere, you end up somewhere, or indeed somewhere else. In other words, it is association that tells you about the stickiness or fluidity of the class structure. Technically, this is measured by something called odds ratios. The important thing is that the odds ratios depend only on the frequencies in the body of the table, not on the marginal distributions. That means we can take the origin and destination marginal distributions of any table and by a piece of statistical magic conjoin them with the odds ratios from a completely different table. That means we can ask, what would social class mobility look like in 2014-18 if we kept the observed origin and destination class structure for those years, but used our statistical magic to assume that the odds ratios describing association in the table were the same as the ones that we observed in the early 1970s. Now, the answer to that question is contained in the bottom table, which gives you the difference between what we actually observed in 2014-18, the top table, and this hypothetical counterfactual scenario. In some cases, the differences are quite striking. There's a 7 percentage point increase in the number of men with a class 1 origin remaining in class 1, and a 5 percentage point increase in the number of men with a class 7 origin remaining in class 7. Downward mobility from class 1 and class 2 to classes 6 and 7 is either substantially reduced or in a couple of cases eliminated entirely. Now, of course, this is just a party trick, but it does give you some kind of feeling for the possible magnitude of the changes, if they are real. I would say that these are not negligible, especially if one remembers the very large number of people at the population level that would be affected by even quite small percentage differences. In this talk, I've concentrated on a relatively narrow range of topics and neglected many more that would be well worth discussing if I had more time. An issue that is frequently aired in the press is where Britain or the UK stands in the International League Table of Social Mobility. More often than not, the assertion is made that we are languishing in the relegation zone, but actually, as with so many things, a closer examination of the evidence suggests that this is probably not true, and a more justifiable conclusion would be that we are actually in mid-table along with a lot of other medium-sized developed countries, neither doing especially well nor especially badly. I said nothing at all about intra-generational mobility, though it should be obvious that people have careers that evolve over time, and during the course of those careers may change their class position. I've made no direct comparison between men and women or considered the implications that people live in households and to some degree share their level of welfare and perhaps their class position with other members of the household. I've completely neglected sources of social mobility outside of the labour market, for example, the marriage market, and I've said nothing at all about the processes that lead to social mobility. To what extent are education, luck, ability, genetics, and all the other things that common sense suggests are relevant implicated in the process? I've also not said anything about other sources of population heterogeneity, like ethnicity or migration status. Are the mobility experiences of second-generation migrants the same as those of the first generation? Are they the same as those of the rest of the population? All these, and many more, are areas of active research, but we will have to consider them on some other occasion.